Hello, my name is Robert Dean Steele, and today we're talking about the times in which we live. And it's so important that we understand the times in which we live. And of course, we're going to do a great today, and that victory in the power of God. Now, start situation is and us a target of government. And today did did develop react to uh, did he on or next those you can we have seas. Anyway, I wanted to spend some time with you because right now there's an awful lot of uncertainty. It's just just like what happened in March of 2020. It seems kind of interesting that 4 years later, my country of Canada has now found itself back into a very similar situation like the pandemic, where outside forces have basically forced us to react in a, to deal with it. Of course, this week on Tuesday, the United States, of course, put a 25% tariff on top of Canada and basically said, we have not done enough to deal with the immigration problem and the fentanyl problem. The reality of the situation is that Mr. Trump has decided, for whatever reason, he has decided that he is going to um, deal with a long time partner. Now, when you find yourself, and I want to bring this to kind of where we are according to the Bible. There was a guy whose name was Haggai. Now, Haggai was actually a co prophet with another individual called Zechariah. Now, Zechariah was the younger of the two men. In fact, according to Dr. Peter Craigie and other scholars, Haggai was actually 90 years old when he got called to be a prophet. Now, it was just after the Jewish people were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and Judea. It was a very exciting time for them. They had spent 70 years in captivity. And the reason why they were in captivity is because of their rebellion, because of their disobedience, and also as well because of their idol worship. They have been warned a number of times, in fact, several generations, to turn away from their sin, to turn away from their hardness of heart, to turn away from their idolatry, to turn away from their rebellion. And they did not. Now, there was times that the king would come into play, and the last king who's really served the Lord was a guy named Josiah. Now, Josiah, of course, was a young man who had come to the throne as a young man. And when he was around 16 or 17 years old, he was looking to put his mark on his country. And so he decided to do it the godly way. And he went and contacted the high priest and said, listen, Mr. High Priest, what can we do to improve our status and improve our country? And of course, the high priest said, well, you need to turn back to the Lord. And so he became very zealous for the Lord, basically cleaned the land of all idols and all paraphernalia that would have been associated with it. He did a great cleansing of the land. And then he instituted a great Passover, and the people rejoiced. There was something happening undergirding even though there was a revival going on, there was a prophet at the same time who was young like Josiah, and he was idealistic, but he was looking at something. He noticed that the people had a form of godliness. They went along with what was going on in the nation at the time, but inwardly and secretly, they were still doing idols. In fact, uh, Jeremiah came across a bunch of ladies, and these ladies were in a special grove, and he was out walking, and he came across them, and he says, "What are you doing?" They said, "Well, we are offering incense to the Queen of Heaven." And he says, "Well, don't you know you're not supposed to do that?" And their response was, "Well, ever since we stopped offering incense to the Queen of Heaven, our nation has been in ruin." And he said, it's not because of that. It's because of your idolatry. It's because of your rebellion. It's because of the hardness of your heart. That's the reason why we're in trouble. But you see, when people get something stuck in their minds, well, of course, they get stuck in their minds. So Hezekiah, or I should say Josiah, was doing a great work for God, but the nation itself was only partially following the Lord. So Jeremiah saw that. Well, after Josiah was tragically killed in a battle with the Egyptians, members of his family came into, of course, the into prominence, and also at the same time there was a great empire shift. Basically, what was happening was the great battle of Carchemish. The battle of Carchemish was between the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians. And the Babylonians won the battle. And by doing that, they literally defeated the two major empires that were, influential within that area of Jerusalem and also of Samaria. And so basically, he comes down, that's Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar dethrones the king that was put on by the Egyptian leader and installed his own king. And Judah and Jerusalem became a vassal province of the nation of Babylon. Well, when Zedekiah came to the throne, he decided to secretly make a alliance with Egypt. And when Nebuchadnezzar found out, he was none too happy about it. And he brought all of his forces down into the area of Jerusalem and Judea and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem, ravaged the area of Judah, and carried back the majority of the population. He left a few people left who were he would consider insignificant. And then he also transported people from other parts of the Babylonian Empire to basically become settlers in the land of Judah. So the nation, or I should say, the nation of Judah and the Jewish people were then transported into various parts of the empire. And part of those people, of course, was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And also, as well, later on, it would be Mordecai and Esther. Anyway, what happened was it would take 70 years for them to return. Now, it was also interesting that in Isaiah 45 and 46, Isaiah looks into the future. And what does he see? He sees a Persian king called Cyrus. So when Cyrus came into, of course, prominence and became the king of, he overcame the Babylonian Empire and he became king of Persia. And because he came Persia, somebody approached him. Many people believe it was probably Daniel, but either way, someone approached him about the prophecy that was contained within Isaiah. So, what did he do? He made a decree. And that decree was that if the people wished, that was being Jewish people, wished to return to Jerusalem, they could. And not only did he allow them to return, but he also gave them supplies and also, as well, all the implements from the temple that had been taken from the temple and the Jewish aristocracy, and he returned all of them so that they could rebuild their temple. Well, they got back to, of course, the city of Jerusalem and the area of Judea, and they were very, very excited. They were, ecstatic. They were looking forward to a wonderful future. Well, how many of us know that many times outside events can certainly catch us? And that's exactly what happened. They were back and they were building the temple and they were reestablishing their prominence and their governorship over the area of Judah. Unfortunately, when Cyrus passed from the mortal part of life, another ruler came into prominence. And the enemies of Jerusalem and Judah were able to write a letter to the then Persian king. And they made some accusations against the Jewish and people of Judah and Jerusalem. And they were able to succeed to stop the building of the temple and also the prosperity of the Jewish people. And so there you have this area where for a long period of time, we're not sure how long it was, some say several years, but anyway, what happened was this: they ended up, of course, being economically impoverished because they were not able to trade from the areas around, and they had fallen into disfavor. And that's kind of what's happened to Canada right now. You see, until about 2 months ago, there was this smooth working trade partnership with the United States. But when the present leadership, the president of this particular United States at this time, which is Donald Trump, he has in his mind that there is a trade imbalance between Canada and, of course, the United States, and Mexico and the United States, and China and the United States, which are the three largest trading partners. Now, on Tuesday, he imposed basically 20% tariffs on China. He'd already put 10% on, and he added another 10%. So China is dealing with 20% tariffs, and Canada is dealing with 25% tariffs. Now, there is a problem that we have here in Canada, and that is the fact that we have just a little over 10%, maybe 13% of the total population of the United States. We have the same population of probably California. And Canada has vast resources, but we don't have an awful lot of people. And we do have an economy that is actually larger than Russia. But the reality of the situation is the reason why we have done so well is because most of the products that we sell and send is to the United States. That is, of course, to our detriment. And the reason I say it's to our detriment is because that's not how it used to be. How it used to be before we had what we call NAFTA. Now, back in the late 70s and early 80s, we had a government that was more socialistic. But in 1984, we had a progressive minded leader whose name was Brian Mulroney. And Brian Mulroney started working with Ronald Reagan and then later on George Bush about instead of creating barriers between Canada and the United States, that we would lower the barriers. And so they were able to, of course, negotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this particular agreement was in practice until, of course, 2018. And it was an advantage for both countries. This way, Canada had access to the United States market, and United States had access to Canada's resources. And it was a very good working relationship. And because Canada, for most of those years, had a value of dollar that is less than the United States, many times Canada would, the United States dollar would basically have $1.40 uh, per a 40 cents advantage is what I'm trying to say. So right now, if you were to purchase a American dollar in Canadian dollars, you would have to come up with $1.40. That's basically how it works. So it was a great advantage to the United States. Now, there were some disadvantages to Canada. In the early 70s, Canada was selling about 17% of our oil to the United States. But because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, we made a decision as a nation that we would sell our oil and certain minerals at a discount price. We saw it as an advantage because the simple fact is that we had access to the American market, but it also made us vulnerable to future, of course, trade disputes. We always had a very positive working relationship with Mr. Bush. We had positive relationships with Mr. Clinton and with Mr. Bush again, and then also as well Mr. Obama and Mr. Trump. But Mr. Trump decided that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. And 6 years ago, when he made it, he said it's the best deal of all. Somewhere along those 6 years, he came with the idea that it wasn't a good deal for the Americans. And he got into his mind that, of course, they were going to have that the only way that they could balance this all out was to bring tariffs. Now, not long after the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, Mexico was able to do the same. Now, Mexico, of course, their wages are substantially lower than Canada, but Canada still does not have the economic power, buying power that the United States does. So it has put us into a deep disadvantage. For example, Canada now sells 62% of its oil reserves to the States. Now, a game changer for Canada has been the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which at one time was only producing or carrying about 300,000 barrels of oil to Vancouver. It is now tripled that to 900,000 barrels. And so we've been able to diversify to a certain point the amount of oil that we sell, but we still sell the majority to the United States. And when this tariff war started, Mr. Trump said, okay, what we're going to do is we will just put a 10% tax on Canadian oil. And then, of course, yesterday he said that the American, that being the car people, didn't have to worry about tariffs for another 30 days. Basically, he knew that if he continued having that 25% on the auto market, what would happen? It would literally collapse. So he's trying to get the automakers to move out of Canada and Mexico and head up into, of course, United States. And which is fine, except for the fact that, United States only produces approximately about 25% of the total automobiles in the world. But because of the fact that people have, from all over the world are sending their automobiles into the United States, then that works quite well for the United States. Now, what happens is, of course, you have this economic shock that has hit Canada. And this is what the nation of Judah was going through. They had great potential and things were starting to hum along, and then outside activity put a stop to all of that. And their prosperity was stopped, their economics was stopped, and their attempt to build, of course, the temple had stopped for a period of time. And that's where Haggai and that's where Zechariah come in. Now, listen to what Haggai had to say here. In the 21st day of the seventh month, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the remnant of people, saying, ask them, Who is of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? And ask them, okay, how does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua of son of Jehozadak, and high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. So here you have this 90-year-old prophet coming forward and saying, gentlemen, you need to understand something. Even though it looks bad, the Lord is with you. Now, that is something that gives us here in Canada a great confidence. And I'll tell you why. Because Canada started off really, really well. When we became a nation, one of the things that our Confederation fathers wanted to do is they wanted to start our nation off with a Christian theme. And so when the Confederation fathers were looking at this whole situation, what they decided to do was one of them was in his Bible and he was praying. He says, Lord, what do you want our nation to be defined at? What does this nation want to project itself? And what is its legacy in the future? And he came across a wonderful scripture found in Psalm 72, verse number 8. And it simply said, he will have dominion from sea to sea. So he went to his other Confederation fathers that were meeting at the time in Charlottetown in 1867. And he says, we know that the United States, because remember, United States and Canada have not always been the relationship that we've had. Back in 1812, there was a war between Canada and the United States, and Canada actually won it and actually burnt the White House. Canadians burnt the White House. So we are pretty tough people up here. But anyway, as it turned out, the nation of United States was, of course, coming into its own. And so what happened was they were looking at their northern neighbor and they knew that we were talking about independence. And so they made two requests. Number one, don't call yourself the Republic of Canada because that, defines what we are. And don't call yourself a kingdom because at that time, United States didn't have the best relationship with the United Kingdom, not like they do today. So anyway, they were looking for something that would, give us something that both the United States and the British Crown, Queen Victoria, would be able to live with. And so when they came across this scripture, he shall have dominion from sea to sea, they said, let us call it the Dominion of Canada. And because most of them were Christians, they said, let us also establish this nation with a godly heritage. Well, that godly heritage, of course, was very strong until about the 1960s. Now, what happened in the 1960s, of course, was that a lady named Madeleine O'Hair, who was an atheist, she was able to get both prayer and the Bible out of schools. And our country followed suit because at that time, our country was ruled by the liberals. And because the liberals are the liberals, I remember I was in school at the time. And one Friday, we were doing the Lord's Prayer and we were having grace at uh, lunchtime and we were reading a Bible passage. The next Monday, it was all gone. There was a decree from on high that said this is not going to happen anymore in Canadian public schools. And that was the beginning of the downward slide of the nation of Canada. Slowly but surely, we began to fall